In the series of political parties in Western countries, the Socialist Party is a very common name, such as American Socialist Party, French Socialist Party, German Social Democratic Party, etc. Many of these political parties were born out of the socialist trend of thought in the 19th century, which advocated the peaceful transition of capitalism to the socialist stage through reform rather than violent revolution. In the category of capitalism, the Socialist Party and the Communist Party belong to the left wing, but one is moderate and the other is radical. Therefore, for a long period of time in the 20th century, capitalist regimes have been wooing and uniting the Socialist Party. For example, in the turbulent 1940s, a considerable number of people in the United States believed that Yan'an belonged to the category of the Socialist Party. The most typical representative is US President Roosevelt, who once commented, "The members of the Communist Party who observe China from thousands of miles away seem to be no different from what we call Socialist Party members. Their attitude towards the peasants, women, and Japan is worthy of our approval." Therefore, the Chinese Communist Party is similar to the nationalist government. There are many, but there are few differences. In order to study the 8th Root Army and the Communist Party in more depth, on July 22 and August 7, 1944, the U.S. military sent two groups of observation teams totaling 18 people to Yan'an. This was a request Roosevelt personally made to Chiang Kai-shek. The American diplomat's attitude towards Yan'an has a basic starting point: to protect the interests of the United States in China to the greatest extent, and to prevent the Soviet Union from getting involved in China after the war. There is an illusion in Washington that Yan'an and Moscow are essentially different. On this basis, they hope to divide the two as much as possible for their own use. Although Americans' cognitive planning for Yan'an and Chongqing is somewhat wishful thinking, it is not a powerful and unconstrained style. Because in Stalin's original forecast, the Chinese Communist Party was indeed going to adopt the coalition government model, similar to the French Communist Party. When I talked about Ho Chi Minh before, I introduced that who originally joined the French Socialist Party. In December 1920, the French Socialist Party held a congress in Tours, and the left and right factions had a heated discussion on whether to join the Communist International. As a result, the majority represented by Cajun decided to set up a separate French branch of the Comintern, category of the Third International, that is, the French Communist Party in the future, while the minority retained the title of the French Socialist Party, also known as the Workers' International. French section, category of the Second International. When World War II ended in 1945, the French Communist Party was very strong, with more than 800,000 members at its peak, and was once the largest party in France. However, in the demarcation of the Yalta Conference, the French Communist Party was completely reduced to Stalin's bargaining chip, and was used as a pawn to make deals with the United States and Britain. Moscow demanded that the French Communist Party disarm, cooperated with the government authorities supported by Britain and the United States, and embarked on the road of participating in parliament and being a minority, just as Marshall expected during the Chongqing negotiations. If they disagreed and wanted to resist, Moscow stood by and let them be slaughtered. From 1945 to 1949, the French Communist Party declined rapidly due to political stances and other reasons, while the French Socialist Party, also left-wing, was accepted by the authorities by virtue of its support for the Marshall Plan, and gradually grew stronger. Since the Fifth French Republic, the Socialist Party has had two presidents, Mitterrand and Hollande. Considering that the current President Macron was the Deputy Secretary General of President Hollande during the Socialist Party, and that the Kadima party he formed was actually born out of the original Socialist Party, so it can be barely counted. Ho Chi Minh at the French Socialist Party Congress, 1920. The perspective returns to China at a time when the situation is changing. It took roughly half a year to a year for the Soviet Union to change its attitude towards the issue of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, from positioning and forming a coalition government to armed revolution. There were two driving factors during this period. The first was Mao Zedong's uncompromising attitude, and the second was the intervention of the United States. Everyone has heard of the former. Mao Zedong was deeply concerned about Stalin's intervention in 1945, and often criticized Stalin's move on different occasions as not allowing revolution. Objectively, the involvement of the United States is also an important reason for Moscow to support our party. History books always mention the events of 1945 when the U.S. Marine Corps landed in the northern port of China and transported the Kuomintang troops from the southwest to the front lines in northeast and north China. In fact, the main target of the United States at that time was the Soviet Red Army. Truman worried that the 1.5 million Soviet Red Army would not stop after entering northeast China, so he arranged for the Marine Corps to quickly land in Tianjin, Qingdao, and other places in North China to form a strategic fulcrum. At the same time, he sent warships to transport the elite of the Kuomintang to northeast China. It is said that at the end of World War II, the U.S. military originally formulated the Olympic plan to implement a comprehensive landing operation on the Japanese mainland. The time was initially set for November 1945, and the specific landing location was the southern part of Kyushu Island, Japan. According to the plan, the U.S. military will mobilize more than 400 warships and a strong force of 14 Marine divisions to carry out landing operations on Kyushu Island. After the landing is successful, it will use the southern part of Kyushu Island as a base to gather troops and head north to Tokyo. But Japan simply and neatly raised the white flag, making the Marine Corps deployed by the United States in various parts of the Far East useless for a while. It just so happened that the Chinese battlefield was facing the problem of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party competing to take over the occupied areas, and the entire North and East China region was actually a vacuum zone after Japan's surrender, so the United States directly transferred several Marine divisions without any treaty basis landing in China, on the one hand, deterred the Soviet Red Army in the northeast from going south, and on the other hand, assisted the nationalist government to snatch it. The northernmost point where the U.S. military landed in China was the line from Tanggu to Kinhuangdao. This sensitive area was personally dispatched by the most elite 1st Marine Division, the force in the Changjin Lake battle, and it was only a short distance away from the Soviet Red Army stationed in the northeast. From the point of view of hindsight, the national government's involvement of the U.S. military was a big failure. Although the National Army quickly seized the territory in North China with the help of the U.S. Marine Corps and opened up the sea and land transportation lines, it brought huge side effects. Stalin was extremely angry about the incident. Realizing that it was impossible for Chiang Kai-shek to remain neutral between the United States and the Soviet Union gradually shifted from the vague position of forming a coalition government to a firm attitude of supporting the revolution. From 1945 to 1946, the Soviet Union actually assisted the Northeast Democratic Alliance to take over most of the Northeast. This was a huge benefit, and it was also the most important support the Soviet Union gave to our party at the beginning of the civil war between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. The Northeast Democratic Alliance Army not only obtained a considerable part of the Northeast without fighting, but also obtained a large amount of military aid that they longed for but never received, laying the foundation for the rise of the Northeast Field Army in the future. The U.S. Marine Corps landed in Qingdao and has been stationed for nearly 4 years. Before President Carter and Comrade Xiaoping held a joint press conference in 1979, Carter said mysteriously, "In fact, as early as April 1949, I stayed in Qingdao as a young submarine officer." Deng Xiaoping said humorously after hearing this, "Our troops had surrounded the city, everyone laughed." Visit America, 1979. Unlike the quick adjustments made by the Soviet Union, the United States was immediately caught in a dilemma after sending its Marines to China in 1945. At that time, the willingness to disarm in the United States was very strong. The U.S. Army had 8 million troops before the surrender of Germany, and by December 1945, it had plummeted to 4 million. This was not enough. Under the fierce demands of Congress and the public, by June 1947, there were only 1 million troops left in the U.S. Navy, Army, and Air Force. A huge shortage of troops made the United States completely unable to fight a land war with the Soviet Union, and could only rely on the nuclear deterrence of the atomic bomb to support the facade. Specific to the Chinese battlefield, if the United States directly sends troops to intervene in the conflict between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, it will very likely be involved in an all-out war with the Soviet Union. This is something that no American wants to happen. On the other hand, in the world power vacuum formed after World War II, the US-Soviet contest was not limited to China, but more importantly, Europe, the Middle East, etc., all of which involved Washington's sensitive nerves. In the face of fierce confrontation around the world, it is said that in 1945 and 1946, the United States had secretly deduced the scenario of an all-out war with the Soviet Union. In the internal assessment, the U.S. military judged that the Soviet Union had an absolute advantage in military strength in Europe and the Far East. Once a war broke out, the Far East would have no choice but to keep Japan at all costs, and would not be able to assist Chiang Kai-shek at all. At the end of this article, let us talk about the story of an American observer stationed in Yan'an. His name is Xie Weisai, John Stewart Service. Xian Weizai was born in Chengdu, Sichuan province in 1909. His parents were missionaries. He lived in China for 15 years as a teenager and could speak Sichuan dialect fluently. In 1924, the Xi Wei's family immigrated to California. After graduating from college, he passed the diplomat examination and was sent back to China in the mid-1930s, where he worked under the U.S. ambassador to China, Edward Gorth. In the early days of the anti-Japanese war, Xian Weizai wrote a report criticizing the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek as fascists, which attracted Stilwell's attention. When the United States established an observation mission in Yan'an in 1944, Xian Weizai officially visited the northern Shaanxi base as a representative of the U.S. State Department and stayed for 4 months. In 4 months, Xian Weizai organized his observations and studies on China's national conditions, the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party over the years into a detailed report and sent it back to the U.S. State Department. As a famous pro-communist diplomat, Xian Weizai wrote, "The Communist Party of China knows very well that China cannot jump from the current agricultural society to socialism, and socialism can only come after going through the stage of capitalist development. In the foreseeable future, the policies of the Communist Party of China will not violate the interests of the United States in China, and the Communist Party should be treated with our sympathy and friendliness as much as possible." After solving the prejudice at the ideological level, Xian Weizai believes that the United States should support the Communist Party instead of the national government on the issue of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. They correctly judged that a civil war in China was inevitable, and that the Communist Party was the winner. If the United States supported the Chinese Communist Party, it could take it away from the influence of the Soviet Union. If the United States regarded the Chinese Communist Party as an enemy, they would be closer to the Soviet Union. Regarding the sensitive issue of military aid for the war, Xian Weizai suggested that the U.S. government adopt the British policy on the Tito guerrillas in Yugoslavia, that is, judge whether to provide aid based on the efforts of all parties in fighting the Germans, rather than their ideology. Mao Zedong's signature photo to Xian Weizai, March 1945. During Yan'an, Xian Weizai met Mao Zedong, Liu Shaokai, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, Ren Bixi, Ye Jianying, Dong Biwo, Yang Shankan and other leaders many times, as well as military generals such as Pen Dehui, Chen Yi, Lin Biao, Nai Rongzhen, etc. Among them, he had more than 50 conversations with Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong even asked him, "Can the United States establish a consulate in Yan'an?" Xian Weizai replied, "There are some practical difficulties, mainly because there are so few Americans in the area." For various reasons, Xian Weizai's report did not attract the attention of the U.S. government. These documents were shelved in the archives of the U.S. State Department for 24 years. It was not until 1969, when Nixon started diplomatic work with China, that Xian's report was read again as one of the bases for the White House and the State Department to judge the attitudes of Chinese leaders such as Mao Zedong. In the 1980s, Xian Weizai's more than 30 documents from 1944 to 1945 were compiled and published in a book called The Lost Opportunity in China. After the founding of New China, there was no state council at first, but it was called the Government Affairs Council, and Premier Zhou served as the premier of the council. By 1954, the first state council was established, and our beloved Premier Zhou continued to serve as premier. So, who are the deputy prime ministers? Initially there were 10, and 2 more were appointed later. Let me talk about the first one, Chen Yun. In the government council at the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic of China, he was one of the 4 deputy prime ministers. The state council was formally established, and the other 3 vice premiers Dong Biwo, Guo Moruo, and Wang Yanpi no longer remained in office, and only Chen Yun remained the vice premier. Among the 10 deputy prime ministers, Chen Yun ranked first. He assisted Premier Zhou in the economic construction of the whole country. The most important thing in the war years is to fight the war, and to enter the peacetime is to develop the economy. Therefore, Chen Yun's status is very hot. He has served as the deputy prime minister for more than 20 years, and his official position has reached the national level. The second place, which many people may not think of, is Lin Biao. Lin Biao was the commander-in-chief of the 4th Field Army, and he was recognized as the god of war. He made great contributions and led an army of 1 million to fight from the northeast to Hainan Island. He was invincible across the world. In the early days of the founding of the People's Republic of China, Lin Biao seldom showed his face in public, and mainly focused on rest and recuperation. However, Lin Biao's military exploits and prestige were too high, and he still had many positions. He is the second-ranked vice premier of the State Council. The third place, even more unexpected, is Pen Dehui. Pen Dehui also has a more important part-time job as Minister of National Defense, and at the same time presides over the daily work of the Military Commission. It should be said that Pen Dehui's status is higher than that of Lin Biao. He ranks second among the top 10 marshals, and Lin Biao ranks third. However, both are vice premiers of the State Council, but Lin Biao ranks ahead of Pen Dehui. Lin Biao ranks second and Pen Dehui ranks third. The fourth is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping is a good assistant to Premier Zhou. They knew each other when they were working and studying in France, and forged a deep revolutionary comrade-in-arms friendship in a foreign country. In 1952, Deng Xiaoping served as vice premier of the State Council, and he was re-elected for 5 consecutive terms, with a term of more than 20 years. Among the previous vice premiers of the State Council, Deng Xiaoping ranked relatively high, among the top 4, and later ranked first. The fifth is Deng Zhihui, a well-known rural work expert and concurrently the Minister of Rural Work. Deng Zhihui is a native of Longjian, Fujian. He did not participate in the Long March, but insisted on guerrilla warfare for 3 years. He is one of the 3 heroes in Western Fujian. When he was in the Central Soviet area, he made revolution under the leadership of Chairman Mao. Place is Long. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, he long served as the commander of the Southwest Military Region, and Deng Xiaoping was the political commissar of the Southwest Military Region. Deng Xiaoping took the lead in going to Beijing to serve as the deputy prime minister. In 1954, he long also entered the central government and served as the vice premier of the State Council. He also served as the director of the National Sports Commission for a long time. The seventh is Chen Yi. As the commander-in-chief of the Third Field Army, after the founding of the People's Republic of China, Chen Yi focused his work on the local government and the government. He was the mayor of Shanghai. After entering Beijing as the vice premier in 1954, he continued to serve as the mayor of Shanghai until 1958. In 1958, Chen Yi also served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, assisting Premier Zhou in charge of diplomatic work. Boss Chen's humorous, laughing and scolding personality has become an article, and he has well demonstrated China's demeanor of a great country on the international stage. The eighth place is Ulin Hu, an outstanding revolutionary leader of the Mongolian nationality, and one of the 57 founding generals of the Republic. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, Ulin Hu served as vice premier for 3 consecutive terms. He also served as vice chairman of the National People's Congress, vice chairman of the CPPCC National Committee, and from official to deputy state level. The ninth place is Li Keqiang, who was also an important comrade-in-arms of Premier Zhou during his work-study program in France. He assisted Premier Zhou in the implementation of the National 5-Year Economic Plan. Li Keqiang also served as vice premier for 3 consecutive terms, reaching the national level. The 10th place is Li Xiannian. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, and Li Xiannian served as vice premiers of the State Council for a relatively long time. Li Xiannian held the post for 26 years from 1954 to 1980 when he voluntarily resigned from office as vice premier. Li Xiannian also served as the Minister of Finance, in charge of the country's purse strings. After resigning from the position of vice premier, Li Xiannian successively served as the chairman of the country and the chairman of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, reaching the official state level. In addition to the above 10, Nai Rongzhen and Bo Yubo were also appointed as vice premiers of the State Council later, so there are 12 vice premiers in total. They are the mainstay of the Republic, the country's elite, and old revolutionaries with outstanding achievements. Among them, Lin Biao, Pen Dehui, Yi Long, Chen Yi and Nai Rongzhen were the founding marshals. Among the 12 vice premiers, 5 are at the state level, including Chen Yun, Lin Biao, Deng Xiaoping, Li Keqiang, and Li Xiannian. On July 23, 1921, the first Congress of the Communist Party of China was held in Shanghai, announcing the formal establishment of the Communist Party of China. At the beginning of the founding of the party, the Communist Party of China was a party that had close ties with the outside world. Over the past century, the CCP has maintained friendly exchanges with various progressive forces in the world, including many American friends who objectively introduced China's national conditions and advocated friendly cooperation between China and the United States. To welcome and commemorate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China, the WeChat official account of Shanghai American Studies specially launched a series of special articles looking back, American friends who befriended the CCP, to introduce the classic deeds written by American friends with the CCP in history and the typical examples that them figure. When mentioning the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States, people immediately think of ping-pong diplomacy and Kissinger's Operation Polo. In fact, decades before Kissinger's visit to China, there was an American missionary's son who broke the artificial blockade and established a link between the American people and the Chinese people. He is one of the most famous China hands in the United States in the 1940s, American diplomat John Service. American diplomat born in China. Xie Weisai is an American born in China. His father was a Baptist missionary. In 1905, he and his wife came to Chengdu, China to establish the YMCA. Xie Weisai, the eldest son of the family, was born in Chengdu in August 1909, spent his childhood in Chengdu and Chongqing, and speaks fluent Chinese. At the age of 11, he moved to Shanghai with his parents and studied in an American school there. After the family returned to the United States, Xie Weisai received secondary and college education in the United States, graduating from Oberlin College in Ohio. The young Xie Weisai aspired to engage in diplomacy. He passed the qualification examination of the State Council in 1933 and was officially appointed as a diplomat in 1936. He successively worked in the consulate in Shanghai and the embassy in Chongqing, becoming a young talent active in the diplomatic arena. In August 1943, Xie Weisai went to work at the headquarters of the U.S. Army in China, where General Joseph Stilwell was the commander-in-chief. Taking advantage of his dual identities as a diplomat and military officer, he went deep into China's rural and remote areas, made extensive social investigations, experienced the living environment and conditions of ordinary Chinese people, and strengthened his understanding of China's political, economic, and social conditions. Awareness of the situation. The direct contact with the communists made Xie Weisai unable to continue to believe the clichés of the Kuomintang propaganda machine, and it also aroused his strong curiosity. He realized that in order to truly understand the Communist Party, and to jointly fight the cause of Japan, Americans should go to that remote northwest town of Yan'an. As a result, he has been working tirelessly to establish a link between the U.S. government and the Chinese Communist Party. In July 1944, the U.S. military dispatched the U.S. military observation team under the pseudonym Dixie Mission to Yan'an. Really understand Yan'an and the CCP. On July 22, 1944, the first members of the U.S. military observation team flew to Yan'an. The observation team consisted of 9 people, including David D. Barrett, the military attaché of the embassy in China, John Peyton Davies, the second secretary, and Xie Weisai, the third secretary. And the warm reception and welcome of Mao Zedong and other central leaders. Mao Zedong received the U.S. military observation team. Xie Weisai and other members of the U.S. military observation team had the same impression when they first arrived in Yan'an. They found themselves in a brand new China. Instead of the heat and humidity and fog in Chongqing, there was a dry loess field and a clear blue sky in Yan'an. Compared with the changes in the natural environment, what is more impressive is the changes in the mental state and social atmosphere of the people here. As Seves wrote in his July 28, 1944 report, all of us in our party felt the same way. We seem to have come to another country and met a different people. In the Communist Party, there is an air of vitality and strength, a desire to fight the enemy. This cannot be seen in the China of the Kuomintang. In Yan'an, both officials and civilians dealt with us and the Chinese themselves with each other with openness, directness and friendliness. Mao Zedong and other leaders are widely revered. They are approachable, and no one is servile in front of them. They often mingle with the masses. The tense situation where there are many guard posts and the enemy is often seen in Chongqing is not here. At a glance, there are no police in Yan'an, and soldiers are rarely seen. No beggars, no sign of extreme poverty. People's clothes and life are very simple. Except for farmers, almost everyone wears a tunic-style uniform made of homespun cloth. There is no luxury and extravagance in dressing, living and entertaining. Among all the members of the U.S. military observation team, Xie Weizai talked to Mao Zedong the most. He lived in Yan'an for 3 months. During his stay in Yan'an, he met many times with Mao Zedong, Liu Shaokai, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, Pen Dehui, Ren Bixi, Ye Jianying, Dong Biwu, Yang Shankan and other leaders of the Communist Party of China. As soon as Xie Weizai arrived in Yan'an, he was deeply impressed by the CCP's political clarity and enthusiasm for the war of resistance. He believes that the behavior, way of thinking and straightforward handling of issues of the CCP leaders seem more like Americans than Orientals. Xie Weizai had a total of more than 50 conversations with Mao Zedong in Yan'an, and the longest conversation lasted 6 hours. Based on this, Xie Weizai wrote more than 100 reports to the U.S. government, covering aspects of Yan'an's politics, economy, military and social life. Xie Weizai compiled the records of each conversation into written materials, and reported directly to Stilwell, the then Chief of Staff of the U.S. military in the China Theater, which was highly praised by General Stilwell. On August 23, Mao Zedong had a long talk with Xie Weizai in Zhejiang Cave. Xie Weizai first talked about the understanding and grasp of the situation, and had a preliminary understanding of Yan'an, and said that the overall understanding of Yan'an was good, the society was stable, and people lived and worked in peace and contentment, which was completely different from the situation in the Kuomintang-ruled area. After chatting for a while like this, Mao Zedong invited him to officially enter the topic of conversation. Mao Zedong knew what Xie Weizai was most interested in. The topic mainly revolved around how to avoid the civil war between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, and other arrangements. In the lingering smoke, Mao Zedong and Xie Weizai became more and more interested in talking, and they talked for 6 hours unconsciously. Through dozens of conversations with Mao Zedong, Xie Weizai has a certain understanding of the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. It is recommended to cooperate with the CCP. After many investigations in Yan'an, Xie Weizai made the following suggestion to the U.S. government: while assisting the Kuomintang government in the war of resistance, it also supported the CCP. Doing so is not only conducive to defeating Japan as soon as possible, but also conducive to establishing a constructive relationship with the CCP. Given that Chiang Kai-shek will inevitably launch a civil war after the war, and the result of the civil war must be the victory of the CCP, it is even more necessary to do so. This is called preparing for a rainy day. The CCP is not a vassal or the Soviet Union. If the United States does not handle it properly, it is entirely possible that the CCP will actually fall to the Soviet Union. In mid-February 1945, in a memorandum to the returning General Albert Wedemeyer, he suggested for the first time that the U.S. government pursue a policy toward the Chinese Communist Party similar to that pursued by the Allies toward the Tito partisans in Yugoslavia. That is, like Churchill, judge whether to provide aid according to the efforts of all parties in fighting the Germans, not their ideology. On February 28, 1945, Counselor George Acheson of the American Embassy in Chongqing signed and issued a report drafted by Weizai Xie and signed by all the staff of the American Embassy in Chongqing. In their report, they severely criticized the policy pursued by Patrick Hurley. In order to avoid the United States getting involved in the quagmire of the Chinese Civil War, they suggested that the United States should adjust its China policy according to the following 2 principles. The first is to provide the Chinese Communist Party with aid. The second to obtain concrete military cooperation first, with political cooperation as an inevitable result. The report by Xie Weizai and others caused a controversy in Washington, USA, but was opposed and brutally suppressed by Hurley, and was not adopted by the U.S. government. On March 8, 1945, Xie Weizai came to Yan'an again with approval, preparing to inspect the upcoming 7th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. In Yan'an, he met Mao Zedong several times. Mao Zedong once again clearly expressed his willingness to be friendly and cooperate with the United States. Xie Weizai reported these situations to the U.S. Embassy in Chongqing and Washington in a timely manner. On March 30, he received orders to report immediately to Washington. On the afternoon of April 1, Mao Zedong and Xie Weizai had a farewell talk. Zhou Enlai and Zhu De were also present. The conversation was conducted under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong especially emphasized that once a civil war breaks out in China, he hopes to adopt a non-intervention policy towards both the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. The conversation went all night. Dong Biwu also came at the end of the conversation. This was the last conversation between Xie Weizai and the leaders of the Communist Party of China, involving many important issues such as the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China, China-US relations, and Sino-Soviet relations. Its depth and breadth exceeded previous conversations. Xie Weizai left Yan'an on April 4 and arrived in Washington on April 12. He did not expect that what awaited him after returning home would be a disaster. In April 1945, Xie Weizai was involved in the Amerasia case because he lent some of his reports on China issues to the editor-in-chief of Amerasia magazine. In the 1950s, Xie Weizai was politically persecuted by McCarthyism in the United States. Xie Weizai is a far-sighted China hand in the U.S. State Department, but he has become a scapegoat for the failure of the U.S. policy toward China. In 1956, things began to turn around. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed to reopen his case. On June 17, 1957, in the case of Xie Weizai v. Dulles, Secretary of State, all 9 justices except one abstained ruled in Xie Weizai's favor. The ruling stated that the former Secretary of State Atchison's decision to expel Xie Weizai was contrary to the State Council's own regulations and thus invalid. On July 3, 1957, a federal district court, following the Supreme Court's ruling, ordered the State Department to reinstate Xie Weizai as a diplomat. Nixon returns to China during his visit to China. In 1969, Nixon sent a message of intention to improve relations with China. Mao Zedong lost no time in responding, which quickly led to the closeness and cooperation between China and the United States. On July 21, 1971, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing and invited Fairbank, C. Weiss, and Davis, who lived and worked in China for a long time in the 1940s, to testify and listen to their opinions on Sino-US relations. In September 1971, Premier Zhou Enlai invited Xie Weizai and other members of the U.S. Military Observer Group to revisit China. The Chinese Communists have not forgotten old friends. On September 26, 1971, Xie Weizai in Beijing and set foot on Chinese soil again after a lapse of 27 years. During the 6.5-week itinerary, Xie Weizai visited Nanjing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Guangzhou, Chongqing and other cities. Of course, the visits to Chengdu and Yan'an, the birthplaces, most evoked the old man's memories. He met many old friends, including Vice Foreign Minister Jiao Guanhua, who had given him a blood transfusion back then, and met Dr. Henry Kissinger, Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, who was visiting China for the second time. On the day before the end of the visit, Xie Weizai was received by Zhou Enlai alone. Zhou Enlai expressed concern about the hardships that Xie Weizai had experienced, and asked about the situation of their common old friends Paul Rudd, Davis, Emerson, Vincent, and others. In February 1972, 1 week before U.S. President Richard Nixon's visit to China, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee asked Xie Weizai to recount the past. Xie Weizai said, "My recent visit to China has proved, at least to me personally, that much of what is happening in China today can be learned from what we saw and heard in the CCP base in Yan'an in 1944 and 1945 and how we got there. I think our involvement in Vietnam, our insistence on the need to contain China in order to prevent what we perceive as the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, is still largely based on our perception of China communist misunderstanding, lack of real understanding of the Chinese people, the nature of the Chinese communist movement, and the intentions of their leaders. We are sure they are an aggressive nation. However, I do not think they have ever a tradition of aggression. So I think a lot of what got us stuck in the Vietnam quagmire was our misunderstanding of China and our fear of mediocrity. History has proven that Xie Weizai was right." Senator Fulbright finally said with emotion, "We once regarded ourselves as China's only qualified savior. These diplomats in China serve their country faithfully. However, their country does not always treat them well." In 1984, Xie Weizai visited China again and was received by Li Xiannian and others. On May 11, 1998, in an interview with Chinese scholars, Xie Weizai expressed his deep feelings for the Chinese people in this passage, "I was born in China. I regard China as my second hometown. I love China and her people. I sincerely wish the Chinese people happiness and their country prosperity." On February 4, 1999, 90-year-old Xie Weizai passed away peacefully at home, ending a legendary life. In just over a month, China has made 5 consecutive big moves on the Russian issue. The first is to publish a position paper on the peaceful resolution of conflicts to show the world our attitude. Immediately afterwards, a visit to one of the parties to the conflict, Russia. Meet key players in the conflict, EU leader France. Meet with representatives of third world neutral countries, Brazil. Next, we have a telephone conversation with another party to the conflict, Ukraine. This series of big moves shows that China is serious about promoting the Russian-Ukrainian ceasefire. So, as an irrelevant country outside the region, why do we put so much effort into promoting a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, just because we love peace? Why did we choose this time point in the spring of 2023? In this, China's biggest strategy is actually hidden. One, a special point in time. The spring of 2023 is a special point in time. At present, it is the critical window period of the end of the dollar interest rate hike. At this time, the United States has entered an extremely sensitive and fragile stage. For example, at the latest interest rate meeting on March 23, the Federal Reserve decided to continue raising interest rates by 25 basis points, raising the US dollar interest rate to 5%. This is the second time the Fed has raised interest rates this year and the ninth in this round of rate hike cycle. However, after this meeting on raising interest rates, Fed officials uncharacteristically deleted the statement that it is appropriate to continue raising interest rates in relevant statements, and instead focused on economic recession and financial risks. To put it bluntly, the Fed is no longer afraid to raise interest rates. Why? The reason is simple: if interest rates are raised, the US financial industry will not be able to sustain it. Silicon Valley Bank, which just went bankrupt, is a stark example. As the 16th largest bank in the United States, Silicon Valley Bank sits on assets of $200 billion, and its status in the US financial circle is not low, and its own operation is not a big problem. Before the bankruptcy, the bank had just been named Best Bank in America in 2022 by Forbes magazine. If you insist on saying that Silicon Valley Bank is bankrupt, what mistake did you make? It could be that the bank has invested too much in US treasuries. During the dollar flood in 2020-21, the flood of dollars flowed into Silicon Valley Bank, which invested a large amount of low-interest US Treasury bonds at that time. However, in 2022, in order to curb inflation and save public opinion before the midterm elections, the US government exceeded expectations and raised interest rates sharply, causing the price of US Treasury bonds already purchased to plummet. Taking the most mainstream 10-year US Treasury bond as an example, when the interest rate rises from 1% to 4%, the market price of the bond will fall by more than 20%. Even stock speculators can't bear a 20% loss, let alone a bank known for its steady operation. Therefore, when the losses of Silicon Valley Bank were exposed, depositors quickly ran out, and the bank went bankrupt at the speed of light. Looking back, is the problem encountered by Silicon Valley Bank only a problem of its own? Of course not. US Treasury bonds are known as the safest financial assets in the world and are widely held by the US banking industry. Therefore, floating losses caused by the fall in US bond prices have become a common problem faced by the US banking industry. When Big Thunder has been bought, the US government can no longer raise interest rates in consideration of the safety of the US financial system. So instead of raising interest rates, is it okay to cut interest rates? It doesn't work either. In the past February 2023, the US core CPI grew by 5.5% year-on-year, far higher than the US government's policy target of 2%. At the same time, the chain increased by 0.5%, and inflation has the momentum of further acceleration. JP Morgan Chase predicts that the core CPI in the United States will rise by 0.5% month-on-month in March, showing a momentum of accelerated growth for the fourth consecutive month. Cutting interest rates at this time, the US government's efforts to control inflation throughout last year will obviously be in vain. And capital naturally hates inflation, and long-term high inflation will seriously damage the credit of the US dollar, leading to the recurrence of the US dollar crisis in the 1970s. Therefore, in order to control inflation, the United States cannot lower interest rates, but in order to protect the bank, the United States cannot raise interest rates. Obviously, the United States has reached a very embarrassing time mark. Second, the United States follow up. So besides raising and lowering interest rates, does the United States have any other tricks to get out of the current predicament? Yes, that is to use some special means to trigger wars and export crises around the world. When the economies of other countries collapse, on the one hand, capital flows back to the United States, which can strengthen the credit of the US dollar and boost the US economy. On the other hand, people in other countries save money on food and clothing, which can also lower world prices and inflation for Americans. The United States has done many of these things before. From 1983 to 1984, in order to curb high inflation and start a cycle of interest rate hikes, the debt crisis broke out in Latin American countries represented by Mexico. After these countries went bankrupt, global demand faltered and commodity prices plummeted. Oil prices plummeted from $30 a barrel to less than $10 in 1986. In the end, the loss of jobs and displacement of Latin American people became the price for Americans to reduce inflation. From 1989 to 1990, the target of the United States was replaced by Japan and the Soviet Union. The end was the collapse of the Japanese economic bubble and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In 1999, the United States took aim at the European Union and the newly born euro. The Kosovo War, which lasted for 3 months, caused the ratio of the euro to the US dollar to drop from 1.1:1 to 0.9:1, and the nascent euro completely lost its qualification to compete with the US dollar. And the outbreak of the Russo-Ukraine War in 2022 will let us see the inertial operations of the Americans. However, this trick of the Americans can also be played off. In 2007, due to the rise of China's economy and the prosperity of China's economic and trade cooperation with Japan, South Korea, and Europe, the United States became the weakest link in the world economic system. The US dollar rate hike not only failed to detonate other countries, but punctured the real estate bubble in the United States itself, triggering the subprime mortgage crisis. Since then, the credit of the US dollar has declined severely, and it was not recovered until 2012 when the United States used Goldman Sachs to induce the Greek debt crisis. So looking back, the key to determining the success or failure of the US dollar today is that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is war and peace. If Russia and Ukraine can continue to fight, the United States can continue to grab a lot of benefits in Europe. Like energy benefits. Before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, only 20% of US natural gas sales went to Europe, compared to 60% today. Another example is arms interests. Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, against the background of the US stock market falling by more than 10%, the stock price of Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of the famous Hippocampus rocket, bucked the trend and soared by 30%. Lockheed Martin share price. But most importantly, as long as the war does not stop for a moment, Europe cannot become a safe haven for international capital, and Western capital will eventually be forced to flow to the United States. Even if Russia, China, and other countries are talking about de-dollarization today, the US dollar is still the only and unshakable dominant currency in the Western world. Therefore, we can see that the recent actions of the United States are all intensifying the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. For example, NATO is studying to add 300,000 troops to the Russian border area. The United States recently sent drones close to Crimea, causing a plane crash and stimulating Russia's nerves. In addition, the United States will also increase its arms assistance to Ukraine. Ask Germany to assist Leopard 2 tanks. Ask the Czech Republic and Poland to assist MiG-29 fighter jets. I have to send another 100 sets of Seahorse rocket launchers, vowing to drain the last drop of blood of the Slavs. 3. China-US confrontation. But looking back, let's assume, what if Russia and Ukraine suddenly negotiated peace today? In the current United States, there is a double superposition of an inflation crisis and a banking crisis. The external Ukraine war can be said to be the only iron chain tied to the neck of international capital by the American elite. Once the Russo-Ukraine war is over and the iron chain is broken, international capital will inevitably flee the United States. At that time, the banking crisis and the inflation crisis will both occur, and the collapse of the dollar hegemony is not impossible. Therefore, the United States must not allow Russia and Ukraine to cease fire at this point in time. For us, the strategy is already very clear, that is to do the opposite, push for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and deal a fatal blow to the dollar at the most vulnerable moment of the United States. Doing so is not only in line with international morality, but also an open conspiracy to attack the US dollar. Therefore, we ordinary people can observe that when the Russo-Ukrainian war first broke out, the country did not stand up and shout for a ceasefire between the two sides. Instead, we waited until 1 year later, at this sensitive point in time, when the US dollar interest rate hike was coming to an end and the US economy was under extreme pressure, we suddenly made several big moves. First of all, on February 24th, we issued a 12-point programmatic document on stance on resolving the crisis, establishing the image of the leader of the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire. Then he visited Russia on March 20th to find out Russia's position and cards. Immediately afterwards, he met with the French president on April 5th to clarify the position of the European side. On April 12th, he met with the president of Brazil and prepared to set up a ceasefire negotiating team with Brazil and other countries. Later in late April, foreign media reported that we also had a direct call with Zelensky. This series of sudden actions can be said to have completely disrupted the established arrangements of the Americans regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, and made the American elite group extremely angry. They also completely ignored the so-called peace-loving face, and publicly expressed their rejection of the ceasefire proposal. For example, U.S. White House spokesman Kirby declared in an interview, "Any call for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine is unacceptable." Secretary of State Blinken further stated, "The world should not be fooled by strategic proposals made with the support of Russia, China, or other countries." White House spokesman Kirby, "Russia-Ukraine ceasefire unacceptable." Seeing this, many people may have doubts. The United States is deeply involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and there are its obstacles. Should China, which is on the outside, solve the Russia-Ukraine chaos alone? Is the so-called promotion of peace talks just our wishful thinking? Although the ending is not clear now, Biden believes that there is great hope. Because promoting a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine is not only related to the interests of our country, but also in line with international morality and the general trend of the world. Think back more than 70 years ago, when World War II just ended, the United States pushed for the independence of colonial countries. Although the purpose of the United States at the time was to break the British and French colonial system and establish a new order controlled by itself. But because it conforms to the world trend, it has also won the cooperation of the people of the Third World. As a result, it took only 20 years for the United States to destroy the colonial system established by Britain and France in 200 years. And 70 years later, when the United States, the former dragon slayer, became a dragon, today's China is standing in the position of the United States in the past. Under the banner of human justice, we join forces with Brazil, India, and other countries in the world that are also looking forward to a ceasefire. It does not necessarily mean that we will not break through the obstacles set up by the United States. In addition, the time for peace talks may not be far away. 2 days ago, foreign media broke the news that according to the computer simulation of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict conducted by the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences, the Russian-Ukrainian war is likely to end around the summer of 2023. In the summer of 2023, is this the result of computer deduction, or is the official announcement? We don't know the truth, we can only wait and see. But what is certain is that when Russia and Ukraine make peace and the whole world cheers for it, only the United States will lament alone. Because it will completely lose the chains that hold international capital, and the fuse of the US dollar thunderstorm will also be ignited since then. Movie theaters are often filled with Avengers, Captain America. Why don't we film our own superheroes? All joined the army and seized the enemy's opportunity. 36 people wiped out the western regions and ran for thousands of miles. Chen Tang, who said that those who commit crimes against China will be punished even if they are far away, and Li Jing and Su Dingfang, who fought the war to destroy the country. Wang Suans, who swept the West Pacific, and Zheng Hailong, who defeated the Netherlands. Let's not talk about these ancient times. In the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, countless superheroes have emerged. In the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, there were often volunteers who were so miserable that only one soldier remained to guard the entire position until the follow-up troops came up. Think about it, on the battlefield, there is only one wounded little soldier who can't even stand up, and even the weapons are only stones, but he still sticks to the position, and the position is still in our hands. Isn't that awesome? What does it mean to shock the enemy's guts? What does it mean to sacrifice one's life? This is it. I have no bullets, and I can't even stand up, but the enemy just dare not come up. Blocking the holes of the gun, living forever in the fire, guarding the entire position by one person, and destroying the enemy by tens of thousands of snipers. Which one is not a legend? How do you think the American Wild Wolf was driven from the Yalu River back to the 38th parallel with simple weapons? Not only the spirit, not only the courage, but also the wisdom and various innovative tactics, reverse slope tunnel, anti-strangle, various techniques and tactics, and various innovative inventions can only be achieved through hard work. In the anti-strangle battle, the bridges that had been repaired repeatedly at that time were not enough to bear the load, and the locomotive was the heaviest and could not cross the river. So the soldiers invented a way to cross the river with the locomotive behind, pushing the wagon over, and then using the locomotive to pull it over. The locomotive does not cross the river, and supplies are also transported across the river. After the war, the Soviets also specially sent experts to China to understand and learn from the experience of the Chinese railway soldiers. The foreign consultants of the Soviet Union were full of praise for such indigenous inventions as a cow crossing the river. When they encountered the situation during the Great Patriotic War, they were generally helpless. They thought that if they were in the Soviet Union, these creations would definitely win major scientific invention awards. In addition to crossing the river, there are also Grab 22 points, merge operation, underwater bridge, crawling bridge and so on. Later, the railway soldiers of the volunteer army simply dismantled the important parts such as the Z-beam and steel rails on the iron bridge during the day, and the enemy planes bombed during the day. The train of supplies roared to the front line immediately. Compared with these real histories, the filming of King Kong River can only be hee-hee. Crossing the river is not just relying on building a human bridge and taking your life to fill it. Back then, the volunteer army was much more flexible than in the movies. It is said that the volunteer army has more than a dozen ways to cross the river, and they can cross the upper, middle, and lower reaches. For example, use old shell casings to make a drag bucket, pull a rope, and fly across the river with a swish. They will also build underwater bridges. Below the water surface, it seems that there is no bridge, but actually people and horses can cross it. War is fighting for supplies and logistics. If you have no real skills, how can the volunteers who were killed by the US military in the logistics line force the US military to sit down honestly in Panmunjom? During the 7 days from October 16 to 22 when the enemy's strangling battle was the most rampant, there were 1947 wagons passing through the East and West Qingchuan River Bridge. 490 wagons passed through the Zhikingchuan River Bridge, creating the highest daily traffic record since entering the DPRK. The Americans said that the railways that were blown up were seldom not repaired within 24 hours. The infrastructure maniac we are talking about now, it turned out to be what it was back then. When volunteer soldiers wearing new cotton clothes appeared in Panmunjom, the Yankees were stunned. They said, "I didn't expect the bombing to be so severe, you can still wear cotton clothes, earlier than us." Which battle example is not more magical than today's divine drama? Why bother to write a drama? In fact, history is more exciting than drama. A nation without heroes is pitiful, and a nation that forgets heroes is pathetic. China also wants to promote its own superheroes. Today, China has no shortage of technology and modern film and television heavy industry expression techniques. We must have cultural confidence, tell Chinese stories well, and don't let the stories of heroes disappear in the dust and smoke of history.